Okay, good evening. Welcome again. Last week we heard about the complex and tortured nature of Britain's long-developed relationships with Europe, particularly with the European Union and its predecessor, differently named organisations. This week, we're going to hear a bit more about that subject, and particularly some of the sort of public opinion and reform ideas that have been put forward, and looking forward as well as looking sideways and backwards. And to do this, as last week, we have Professor Simon Hicks, who is the Professor of European and Comparative Politics, and more importantly, the Head of the Government Department.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you all for coming again. So the theme for this week is options for Britain, and the key issue here is if the relationship between Britain and the rest of the EU is broken, how can it be fixed or settled for a generation in some way? I'll talk a bit about where the EU is heading and why that is a particular challenge for the UK. I'll then talk about some of the options for Britain from a general perspective in terms of the way the EU is designed. And I'll talk then more specifically about the current positions of the British political parties. Interestingly, the British government doesn't actually have a position. Only political parties have a position. So the position as set out by David Cameron is a position of the Conservative Party, not accepted as the government policy. So there isn't actually a government policy right now. I'll then talk about I'll show you some data from British public opinion, and particularly what I find a fascinating ecological fallacy. So those of you who know a bit about statistics will know what that is, but an ecological fallacy is when you have two trends moving in the same direction that seem opposite. So we're seeing rising support for the UK Independence Party and rising support for Britain in the EU at the same time. So I'll come and explain how and why that might be happening when we get towards the end. So where is the EU heading? And this, the way I like to frame this is to think about what the main project for the EU was between the 1980s and the 2000s, was building a continental scale single market, which, as I explained last week, was, at least in part, a British project for Europe. The removal of barriers to the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour, and a common set of rules to govern the single market adopted through the institutions in Brussels. You can think of this as building a microeconomic union. Other people have described this as building the EU as a regulatory state. Jan Domenico Maioni describes it. Now the challenge after the Eurozone crisis, or the sovereign debt crisis within the Eurozone, as is probably more accurate, the challenge now for the rest of the EU, so the EU member states that are the Euro member states plus the member states who expect to adopt the Euro at some point, which is everybody except the UK and Sweden, is to build economic and monetary union into deeper monetary union of some kind, to reinforce the Euro, to build a new architecture for governing the Euro. And you can think about this as a macroeconomic union of some kind. A common European bailout fund, the Fiscal Compact Treaty, which was signed by all the EU member states except the UK and the Czech Republic, a pact signed by most EU member states to agree to coordinate national macroeconomic policies, now the provisions for a banking union with a common governance arrangement for banks for most EU member states, and the European Central Bank as the lender of last resort and its quantitative easing programme, to which Britain is not part. So here's the EU as it currently stands. We have in the light blue there the EU 18 member states that are member states of the Euro. We then have the yellow member states here, or orange as I think it comes out on the slides here, the member states outside the Euro who expect to join the Euro. We then have Denmark, which has an opt-out from the EU currency, but has its currency pegged to the Euro. You then have the UK, which has a formal Euro opt-out and has decided not to join. And then you have a few member states outside the EU who actually have the Euro as their official currency. So that's Kosovo and Montenegro. And if you think about the new architecture that is being built, you have the European Stability Mechanism, which is a bailout fund of several trillion euros, which is, in a sense, the nuclear weapon the EU has against any future Eurozone debt crisis. All the 18 Eurozone member states have signed up to this, so they've committed resources to this as a percentage of their GDP. You then have this treaty which commits the member states, or commits 26 of the member states, except Croatia, Czech Republic and the UK, commits them to reform their domestic constitutions or laws to ensure they have balanced budgets. You have a Euro Plus Pact, which is this pact between the Euro member states for coordinating macroeconomic policies like pensions policies, unemployment benefit and so on, retirement ages. And then you have a banking union. And the common thing you see here is the UK is the only member state that has not signed up to any of this new architecture. So the rest of the EU is building deeper economic and monetary union of some kind. And you sometimes read in the British press that the UK could be the leader of the outs, i.e. the member states not in the euro. And immediately you'd see this and say, that's a bit nuts, in that most of the outs expect to be ins, and only a few, Sweden, Hungary, Czech Republic, Croatia, are probably not going to join the euro in the next 5 years. That's not many. And of those, the UK is the only member state that's not signed up to one or other of the new pieces of the architecture that's being built to govern the euro. Right? So there's something very specific about the challenge now facing the UK. And there was a piece by Nigel Lawson I think it was in the Times, and he said the challenge for the UK going forward is whether to be isolated inside the EU or isolated outside the EU. And no matter what government was in Downing Street, no matter what Prime Minister was in Downing Street, the challenge would be the same. The challenge, whether this is David Cameron or Ed Miliband or someone else as Prime Minister after the next election, the challenge will be the same. How do you deal with the fact the UK is de facto in the second tier of what is being built? Now, how much you would worry about that depends on how seriously you think this is. How important, is this a fundamental shift or change in the way the EU is being built? And there are certain people across Europe who argue that the key focus of the EU going forward in the next 10 years is building deeper economic and monetary union, building a macroeconomic union, a new deal for Europe in the same way the US federal government went through the transformation of the federal government in the 1930s. Europe is going through the same thing right now, moving from a regulatory state, in a sense, to a fiscal state. Other people like Wolfgang Munchau in the Financial Times will say this is just cheap talk, this architecture doesn't really mean anything, the EU is not going anywhere near as far as it needs to go, and most of the action is still really in the single market. And the challenge for Europe is governing the single market and generating growth in the single market, reforming the single market, the integration of the digital economy, integration of energy markets, the further deregulation of the services market and so on, creating a new European-wide bond market, new capital union, all these types of issues, of which, if the youth believe that is still the driving force of Europe in the next 5-10 years, then the UK is at the top table on those issues. But if you think this is significant, then the UK is definitely not at the top table. And one indication of this, I think, is the UK was not going to have any of the top jobs in the EU. So was not going to have the Commission President, was not going to have the President of the European Council, was not going to have the chair of the Eurogroup, was not going to have any of the key figures inside the Commission. And so that's an indication that none of the other member states would trust the UK to have any of the top jobs in Brussels. Because in a sense, you wouldn't want a member state that's kind of 1 foot outside the EU to have one of the key jobs in the way the EU institutions work. And that's a step change from the long history of the UK's relationship with the EU. So in practice, right now, we have a semi-detached relationship, whether we like it or not. So what are the options, given what I've just said? Well, join the euro, like that's going to happen. The status quo, we kind of carry on as we are in this semi-detached status, and we muddle along the way we traditionally like to do in the UK. And I can't remember who it was, someone in Brussels said, never underestimate the ability of the EU to find a way to muddle through. And that's very much what could happen. And then the Cabinet Office, in an internal paper that I saw, described in a typically British way that's deliberately confusing to continental Europeans, options for Britain. And they defined two different options. One they described as mind the gap, and the other one they described as widen the channel. And I've spent no end of time explaining to continental Europeans what the hell these means. Widen the gap, they say that on the tube when you're in London. Oh, what? Why do you have to mind the gap? Oh, God. Mind the gap, the idea here is some sort of safeguards for the UK within the current EU architecture. Some kind of protocol perhaps attached to the treaties which recognises the interests of the UK as a big member state with a concentrated industry, namely financial services, and with sort of one foot not fully engaged in the architecture that's being built. Widen the channel. Recall I started last week's lecture with fog in the channel, Europe cut off. Widen the channel, a common theme through British rhetoric about Europe. We're different to them. There's a piece of water that's 20 miles wide between us and them. Is recognise the UK should have particular opt-outs, not just an opt-out from the single currency, an opt-out of social policy. Of course, we in Britain don't want the kind of social standards those socialists on the continent have. We like to abuse our workers and feel we want to do that. Fisheries, we don't want any rules saying that we can't fish as many fish as we want to and make sure there's no more fish for anyone to eat in 10 years. We should be free to do that if we want to. And free movement of people, we don't like all those foreigners coming into Britain, and we should be able to say no, even though 1 million continental Europeans live in the UK and 1 million British citizens live on the continent. And in fact, the million EU citizens who live in the UK are net contributors to the Exchequer, and the million UK residents who live on the continent, mainly in Spain, are massive consumers of free Spanish healthcare. But that's beside the point. So they're the kind of two options in this paper. There is a fifth option, which the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons actually seriously considered in a paper called Options for Britain, which is exit. If we left the EU, what would be options for Britain if we exited? And there's two obvious ones. One is Norway and one is Switzerland, the two rich member states outside the EU. And Daniel Hannan, a prominent Eurosceptic Conservative MEP, likes to point out, he's clearly not a social scientist, he says, Norway and Switzerland are the richest countries in Europe and they're not in the EU. So clearly the reason they're rich is that they're not in the EU. I think no, the reason they're not in the EU is because they're too rich not to join the EU. But anyway, Norway is in an agreement thing called the European Economic Area. The European Economic Area means that Norway is not in the EU but is part of the single market, free movement of goods, services, capital and labour, free movement of people. In return, Norway has to adopt the whole acquis communautaire of the EU. So Norway is the Puerto Rico of the EU. It's the same, exactly the same relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, i.e. you as a Puerto Rican get free movement, you can go live anywhere you want in the US, you can consume all US goods and services, you don't pay any federal taxes, but you get no representation. You're not represented in the House or the Senate, and you don't vote in US presidential elections. So Norway has exactly that relationship with the EU. In fact, worse, they pay tax too. They pay EU taxes. But they're not represented in the European Parliament or the Council or the European Commission. Switzerland is the other alternative. Switzerland has voted repeatedly not to join the EEA, the European Economic Area, and has a series of bilateral agreements where it negotiates bilaterally, sector by sector, access to the EU single market. And there's growing opinion in Switzerland this is not sustainable because increasingly the EU says no when Switzerland asks for bilateral agreements. They ask for a new 100 bilateral agreements and the Commission has just said no to these new bilateral agreements. And there's growing examples of how Switzerland is suffering from these bilateral agreements. Swissair was the first casualty of a major Swiss company for not being part of the EU. Swissair doesn't have landing rights in Europe the same way that European airlines have landing rights. So if you're an EU airline, if you're British Airways, you can fly between any two cities in the EU. You can fly between Toulouse and Paris. You can fly between Paris and Warsaw. You can fly anywhere. If you're Swissair, you can just fly from Switzerland to an EU airport. Right? So you're competing against these other carriers who can do anything you want. And lo and behold, Swissair ended up going bust because they couldn't compete with the European airlines. So the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee had a nice report, Future of the European Union, in June 2013. And the passage in the report that I found most interesting was when the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who are majority Conservative, went to the Storting, the Norwegian Parliament, and went to the Swiss Federal Council, the Swiss Parliament in Bern, and they talked to the members of the Foreign Affairs Committees in these two parliaments. And this is what they wrote in the report. Our witnesses and interlocutors also brought home to us the essential similarity between the positions of Norway and Switzerland, namely that both are in practice obliged to adopt EU legislation over which they had no effective say. On our visits to Oslo and Bern, we gained the impression that both Norway and Switzerland were prepared to accept what they acknowledged to be a democratic deficit as the price for their continued access to parts of the single market. However, our interlocutors in both Bern and Oslo largely advised the UK to remain inside the EU as a way of retaining influence over the legislation that it would be obliged to adopt if it remained part of the single market. So we have this idea, if you believe the right-wing Eurosceptics, we could leave the EU and get access to the single market and cherry-pick the bits and pieces we like. So we would have access to the single market to sell our goods and services in the rest of the EU, and we wouldn't have to apply any European social standards or environment standards or anything else. But why would the rest of the EU give that to us? Why would they allow that? One of the nice examples recently is a piece of legislation going through the EU institutions on the design of truck cabs, lorry cabs. So they're redesigning them because most cyclists are killed because they're hit by lorries because lorries can't see the cyclists because the windows on the cabs don't go down far enough. So there's EU legislation that says all trucks manufactured in the EU will have to have this new design of the cabs that goes down lower, right? So Boris Johnson was actually in Brussels lobbying in favour of this legislation as a kind of Boris Bikes proponent in London, saying that, you know, we want this for Britain. No coverage, of course, in the British press about this thing, because this is something good the EU does. So, OK, we leave the EU. The EU passes this legislation. Do you really think we opt out of it, or we're free to decide whether we opt into this? No. Because all truck manufacturers in Britain will say, well, we have to meet this legislation because we're manufacturing trucks for our market. And our market is the European market. It's not like they're going to have a free choice about this matter. So even if we're not in the single market, our manufacturers or our service providers, if their main market is the single market, we're going to have to apply all the regulations that the EU passes anyway. In fact, there was a nice paper a couple of years ago in a US law journal that my colleague Damien Chalmers sent to me, which was by an American law professor on the external impact of EU regulation on the US market. The US is not in the single market. And the opening passage of her piece said, the average American citizen doesn't realise how much her life is affected by EU law. When she wakes up in the morning and puts on her makeup, she doesn't realise this is regulated by the EU Cosmetics Directive. And when she goes down and pours herself a bowl of cereal, she doesn't realise that her cereals packet is regulated by the EU Labelling and Packaging Directive. And when she goes to work and she picks up her phone at work to phone a colleague, she doesn't realise that her phone is regulated by the EU Data Protection Directive. This is in the United States. They're not in the EU. But if you manufacture anything, the EU is the world's largest market for consumption of goods and services in the world. It's bigger than the United States market. And most of services manufacturers or goods manufacturers have to meet the standards of the EU single market. So even if you're not in the single market and you're selling to it, you have to meet those standards. I want to say one other little thing before I talk to you about what the current parties in Britain think about the options. And this is, how does the revision of the EU treaties work? There's actually two different ways the treaties can be reformed. One is called the ordinary revision procedure. This is think of as a major reform of the EU treaties. So this is where proposals can be submitted by a member state, the European Parliament or the Commission, the European Council, that's the heads of government, after consulting with the Parliament and Commission, come to an agreement to convene a convention. The convention meets and then makes a proposal to an intergovernmental conference, which is a conference of all the governments of the EU member states. The EU member states have to agree on these treaty reforms unanimously. And then, once they're agreed unanimously, the reforms have to be ratified unanimously by every member state, quote, in accordance with their respective constitutional requirements, which either means by parliamentary ratification or by referendum or by both. And a lot of member states now specify that any major treaty reforms have to go through a referendum. Denmark, Ireland, probably France, probably the Netherlands, and several states in Eastern Europe. There's another simplified revision procedure which was introduced at the Lisbon Treaty, which the Conservatives, of course, were opposed to, but now suddenly they've discovered this little bit of the Lisbon Treaty that I actually think might be interesting, which is to reform the part of the treaties that relates to mainly the governance of the single market, or the functioning of the EU institutions, not the basic architecture of the EU. So proposals to amend this second part of the treaty, which applies to the policies of the EU, can be done just essentially by unanimous agreement in the European Council and then ratified by member state parliaments. This was how, for example, the European Stability Mechanism was put into the treaties. So there is a possibility to reform part of the treaties in a relatively quick way. For example, to reform part of the treaties related to the free movement of people and not become part of a major intergovernmental conference with a convention that's going to last 2 years that will then lead to referendums. Okay? So this is relevant for what I've got to say coming next. Meanwhile, among other things, this new government, the coalition government, said to help us think about which bits of the EU we'd like repatriated, let's set up what they call a balance of competences review. And the idea here was to audit of what the EU does and how it affects the UK area by area, 32 policy areas. And you can go to the website there, and you can see, are we connected to the internet here? Here we go. This is you can scroll down and it tells you all about it, and you can download. There they all are, the reports, semester 1, semester 2, culture, transport, research and development. So this was like an audit. And the Conservative Party thought that this would be a way of finding certain policy areas where they could say, we'd like these things changed and brought back home, or the EU to do less of this. And so to change the sort of balance, so they then could have a shopping list of issues on which they'd like reforms. That isn't what happened. So in each of these reports, overwhelmingly when you read them, what they say is, actually the balance of competences is about right, which is very upsetting for a lot of Conservative backbenchers. So now they say, this was captured by the Foreign Office, those mandarins in the Foreign Office are Brussels natives, they love foreigners more than they love us. They only talk to pro-European interest groups, they didn't go out and try and recruit more critical groups, which is actually right, because the evidence they heard was overwhelmingly. And when you think about it, when you think about what groups are going to mobilise for this, so you say, we're going to have a review of the UK of the EU rules on the free movement of people. Who do you think is going to come and give evidence? Big business comes and give evidence and say, oh yeah, we like free movement of people. That means we can hire anyone we want. Or universities give evidence and say, we like free movement of people. We like students coming to us, and we like to be able to hire the best faculty. Who's not going to give evidence? those people who are kind of priced out of a job because of the fact that large immigration is reducing wages in low sectors of the economy. So they don't hear they don't hear from diffuse interests, but they hear from concentrated interests. And those concentrated interests are the interests who generally benefit from UK membership. So the fact that they had a kind of open door, in each of these policy areas we'll have an open door and we'll talk to anyone who comes through that door and we'll write this as our report. Well, overwhelmingly then, they only heard from people who said, actually, what the EU does is okay. So it was, from the beginning, set up, in a sense, to lead to this sort of outcome. They actually delayed the report on the free movement of persons. Theresa May withdrew it because it wasn't critical enough for her. The second version of it eventually came out, and it was had clearly been politically manipulated because it was now far more critical. But overall, the main conclusion is, of course, if you believe the Foreign Office and you believe the Cabinet Office and their role in this, and the British civil servants, the balance of competences between the UK and the EU is about right. This leads to an awkward contradiction for the British government, because you have the leadership of the Conservative Party saying, we want to fundamentally change the relationship between the UK and the rest of the EU, and the other EU member states say, but your civil servants say nothing needs changing. So this is really difficult now for the politicians. So Cameron promised he'd make a big speech on the EU. This was meant to be in September of 2012, and then it was going to be in November of 2012, and he kept delaying. Eventually, he made the speech on the 23rd of January in Bloomberg in the Netherlands. And he set out the big headline, we will have an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the EU in 2017. He thinks the EU should be reformed. He wants the EU to be reformed. He wants the EU to be more democratic. He wants it to be more open, more liberal, more respectful of the rights of member states. And then there would be a referendum in 2017. His speech is actually quite vague in content, and he was criticised for this. And in March of 2014, he wrote a piece in the Sunday Telegraph and set out 7 demands to kind of give some flesh to the bones of what he'd said in his speech. He wanted longer transition on the free movement of people for new accession member states, read Serbia here. He wants curbs on social security benefits for EU migrants. He wants red cards for national parliaments to block EU law. National parliaments can currently delay EU law. If a certain number of national parliaments said we don't like this piece of legislation being drafted, he wants a rule that says automatically it will be withdrawn. He wants deregulation in the single market, particularly in the services sector, and faster free trade agreements. Read here the EU free trade agreement with the United States. He wants ever closer union, not to apply to the UK. They're obsessed with getting this phrase withdrawn from the treaties. They want more power to flow away from Brussels rather than to Brussels. And they want to end the unnecessary interference of the European Court of Human Rights, which most people in Brussels scratched their head and went, well, that's got nothing to do with the EU. European Court of Human Rights is the court of the Council of Europe, which is an intergovernmental body that's nothing to do with the EU. What was also interesting was most of the commentary on the continent was, well, this is a long shopping list, but there's nothing here that can't be achieved without treaty reform. It can all be achieved without treaty reform. Longer transitions on the free movement of people for the new member states. Everybody agrees with that. Almost all other EU member states agree with that. They think they made a mistake with Romania and Bulgaria. Curbs on social security benefits for EU migrants. Denmark's in favour, Germany's in favour, Holland's in favour, Finland's in favour, large number of member states in favour. A red card for a block on EU laws by national parliaments. This was actually an idea borrowed from the Netherlands and a report by the Dutch Parliament on this. Deregulation of the single market, faster trade agreements. This is overwhelmingly supported by centre-right parties in every EU member state except France. Ever close union should not apply to the UK. That's very particular. That would require treaty change, and it's kind of symbolic rather than any real meaning. More power to flow away from Brussels. Oh, yes, we're all in favour of that. You've no idea what that means. and that has got nothing to do with the EU. The problem, though, for Cameron is the backbenchers in his own party want treaty reform. They want, for symbolic reasons, they want the treaty to be reformed, and they want the treaty to say, none of this stuff applies to Britain. Anywhere here, none of it. They want repatriation of social policy, free movement, fisheries, you name it, a long list of stuff. They want ever closer union. They want to be in the EU but not have to apply anything the EU does, and they want the treaty to say that. Why they think they're going to get that is just beyond me. Interestingly, Merkel then came to Britain, and most of the press was saying, Merkel has come to Britain to do a deal with Cameron, and Merkel is going to agree to Cameron's demands, and Merkel is our ally. And she made a speech to 2 houses of Parliament, and she basically said, there's not going to be treaty reform, and if there is going to be treaty reform, we're not going to give you anything. And the British press were like, oh, really? They were amazed by this. So Ed Miliband was under pressure to define some kind of policy for the Labour Party. Conservatives now have a policy. What's the Labour Party policy, everyone kept saying? And they don't really have one. So he made a speech on the 12th of March. Notice this is just before Cameron's Sunday Telegraph article. I believe our country's future lies in the EU. Great. But we want the EU to be reformed. We want economic reform. We want the single market to be reformed. We want the common agricultural policy to be reformed. We want the free trade in the EU. The British Labour Party is a neoliberal free market party, they're telling the rest of Europe. We want longer transition periods of greater than 7 years for new member states. Wait a minute, isn't that what Cameron just said? We want more discretion for member states in the type of benefits they give to EU migrants, e.g. no social security benefits. We want national parliaments to block EU law, i.e. like red cards. We want a British opt-out from the ever closer union. Hang on a minute. Is this Labour Party policy or is this the Conservative Party policy? I don't know. And we want a new lock, he said. No transfer of powers without an in-out referendum. Haven't we just heard that before as well? But anyway, Alexander Stubb, I mentioned him last week, Finnish Prime Minister, LSE alum, married to a Brit, friend of Britain, had this lovely tweet. All this talk of referendums and locks as promised this week by Mr. Miliband is worrying. What if someone just throws away the key? They're worried on the continent that there's a kind of ratcheting up. The Conservatives say one thing and Labour says, we're the same as them, but even more anti-European. And the Conservatives say, no, we're more anti-European than you are. And they kind of keep ratcheting this up. And we want a referendum, and we want a referendum now, and we want a referendum if they even do anything. So this is where we are, the state of British politics. So this was a nice piece. Simon Usherwood wrote this on the blog. This was media coverage of Miliband's referendum announcement. What the media thought that he'd said. So this was number of pieces. 2 of them said there'll be a referendum. 16 of them said there won't be a referendum. 15 of them said the referendum is unlikely. 7 of them said Miliband has a policy. I guess that's news. 14 of them said something else. But what's interesting is here, they reported this as he has the same policy as the Conservatives, but he's saying there isn't going to be a referendum. No transfer of powers without an in-out referendum. So this is the key qualifying statement. He wants all these things, but none of these things would actually increase the power of Brussels. So if they don't increase the power of Brussels, if there's power flowing back to Britain, he'd say we don't need a referendum. He only wants a referendum if there's a new treaty and that treaty transfers more power to Brussels. Cameron then, to ratchet it up even more, 28th of November last year, set out a new list of demands, this time focusing just on migration. So by this time, the UK Independence Party had grown in support, and the UK Independence Party had cleverly reframed the whole issue of Europe around immigration. And so by this time, it had all come down to immigration. Nobody cared about opting out of the ever closer union. Quite rightly, nobody cared about opting out from the ever closer union bit of the... Nobody cared about all these other bits and pieces and a red card for national parliaments. The key thing now was about some new settlement for Britain on the free movement of people. He said 5 things. I want to deport EU job seekers who've not found work within 6 months. Really? You can imagine rounding them up, putting them in trucks and taking them across to France for them to buy Eurostar tickets and come straight back again. Free movement of people. I want 4 years before EU migrants have in-work benefits or housing benefit. Interestingly, he's dropped saying no social security benefits. Why? Because empirical evidence shows there's almost no EU migrants consuming any welfare benefits. Very few. So the kind of welfare scroungers, they don't exist. The benefits EU migrants get are in-work benefits, the kind of benefits the government gives to EU citizens who are being very low paid. The sort of benefits for topping up your wages if you're below a certain level. And housing benefits. They're the 2 benefits that EU migrants get. They don't take pensions, they don't have social security, they don't have all the other things that they've actually studied it and found actually these are the only kind of benefits they get. Which is actually less than what Germany or the Netherlands or Denmark are actually considering right now. They're putting pressure on the Commission to say EU migrants cannot get access to social security or pensions benefits within the first 2 years. This is actually now less than that. No child benefit for children of EU migrants if the child is not in the UK. You can get child benefit if your kids are here in the UK, but you can't get it if your kids are not here. Every other member state agrees with that. No free movement for new accession states until there's some kind of GDP convergence. Make it easier to deport criminals, fraudsters and beggars and ban re-entry. This was really very much geared towards growing press concerns about Romanians. So, conspicuously, he said it was very flagged before he was going to make this speech that he was going to say we want an emergency break. We want to say if there are X number of migrants from the other EU member states in a given year, we want to be able to say no more. And conspicuously, he didn't put that in. And the reading was that he'd spoken to Merkel, and Merkel had said, no way, you do this, you will not get this agreed. All of this stuff is relatively non-contentious. Maybe one is quite contentious, but the rest of them are relatively non-contentious, and most other member states can agree with it. And now the EU is actually, the Commission, Juncker, who David Cameron tried to stop, Juncker is actually in the process of proposing a new reform of free movement of people that covers most of this stuff. So there's quite a lot of support in a lot of the other member states, particularly in Northern Europe, where there's growing support for radical right parties in Denmark, Holland, France and places to pass restrictions on access to benefits in particular, and restrictions on new member states joining the EU. Why does it all boil down to immigration? Well, it boils down to immigration partly because this government, when it came into power, made the silly mistake of saying they wanted to bring net migration into Britain down to the tens of thousands, i.e. below 100,000. And the latest data show that net migration into the UK up to the end of September 2014, so between September 2013 and September 2014, which is the last time the net migration into the UK for that year was almost 300,000. And there's very little, the largest category of migrants into the UK are EU migrants. And so you can't, unless you restrict EU migration, you can't stop it. Second largest category is family reunification, which you can't stop because it's international law applied by British courts. Third largest category is asylum seekers. Fourth largest category, high-skilled workers and students. So actually the only category they really can restrict is high-skilled workers and students. So they're not going to restrict students because the universities have gone nuts when they tried to do that. So what are they left to restrict? They're left restricting highly skilled workers. They've got limits on the number of work permits they issue for highly skilled workers. It's the only category of migration into the UK the government can actually restrict. Seems a bit mad. What about the other parties? Well, the Lib Dems say we are the party of in. They don't want a new relationship for Britain. They want free market reform, especially services liberalisation. And like Labour, they say there will be a referendum, not an in-out referendum, but there will be a referendum if there's a transfer of any new powers to Brussels. The UK Independence Party, as we know, say we want a referendum and we want it now. And this is relevant for what might happen after the next election. Interestingly, there were two head-to-head debates between Clegg and Farage in the build-up to the European elections, and the perception was that Clegg did very badly, particularly in the second of these debates, and Farage did very well. UKIP then went on to win the European elections in May 2014, and the rise of UKIP is very worrying for Conservative backbenchers, particularly in marginal seats. There's lots of different campaigns out there. One of them is the Let Britain Decide campaign, which is a front for the Conservative Party. Labour and the Lib Dems won't give you a say. UKIP can't give you a say. Only the Conservatives can and will give you a referendum on Europe. Okay. So the government then, to try to bounce the Lib Dems on this and to embarrass the Lib Dems, not the government, the Conservatives, which is why it's difficult to say, even though Cameron is the Prime Minister and Cameron is making these policies, these are not the official policies of the British government. These are the policies of the British Conservative Party. The Conservatives published a draft referendum bill, and they couldn't propose it to Parliament because the Lib Dems refused to support it. So what they did is they gave it to a backbench MP, James Wharton, and it passed through Parliament. Interestingly, it was passed in the House of Commons by 304 votes to 0. That means the Lib Dem and Labour abstained. They didn't want to go on record voting against it. That just tells you where they are on this. They would have been split had there been a party whip to vote against, particularly Labour. So there were 304 Conservatives. Remember, 326 is a majority. So 304 Conservatives voted for this.
That's more than... It's exactly the total.
650.
Sorry, yes.
There were 650, Tony. Half of 650
is
325
just,
plus one.
Yeah. No, it's just the Tories.
The bill, interestingly, included a question. Do you think the United Kingdom should be a member of the European Union? That is a bit odd as a question to put in a referendum. And it was Pat Dunleavy, my colleague here at LSE, wrote a nice blog piece to say this is a really strange question. It's really misleading because, number one, it assumes you're misleading the voters and saying you're not a member. You're voting now to decide whether you want to join. Or you're saying periodically member states get to decide whether they want to carry on being a member, kind of like renewing your tennis club membership, you know. Once a year you decide you're going to renew your tennis club membership. So, do you want to renew your membership of the EU for this year? Nah, maybe next year. But that's what that says to me, right? But then I promised you I'd show you something about public opinion. So YouGov, this is from September 2010 up to the most recent one, February 2015. These are the polls, the YouGov EU referendum tracker. And the nice thing about YouGov is you can just go to their website and download all the data. You download the data and create little graphs. And so you can see this is those in favour of leaving the EU versus those in favour of remaining in the EU. And so leaving the EU, close to 50%, above 50% in August 2011, fell down above 50% for bits of 2012, starts to decline. Wow, suddenly the favour of staying in the EU in May of this year is higher than leaving the EU. And in the most recent one, February 2015, we've got a 10-point gap of staying in the... That's the largest gap since they've been doing these polls in September 2010. So at the same time as we've seen rising support for the UK Independence Party, we've seen growing support for Britain staying in the EU, which is a lovely ecological fallacy, because at the one time you can say Britain is becoming more pro-European and Britain is becoming more anti-European. So why is this? And I think the perception is that there's a lot of moderate voters who for a long time thought, well, I don't particularly like Europe, I guess I would vote to leave. But now there's a political party, and Nigel Farage is head of that party, and he's mobilising. They see this question as, do I agree with Nigel Farage? And so the average voter says, if being anti-European means I agree with Nigel Farage, then I guess I must be pro-European. So the more it becomes mobilising as an issue, the more moderates have to take sides, and the more moderates start to say, wait a minute, if there really is a debate about this, I'm definitely not on his side. So this has implications for what might happen after the election, as I'm going to talk about. One interesting thing also from the YouGov surveys is, how would you vote in a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU if David Cameron secured the following renegotiation of our relationship? There's no negotiation. This was about 6 months ago they did this. So that was vote to leave. Some modest renegotiation, vote to stay. A major renegotiation, we don't know what that means. They would definitely vote to stay. So the idea is there's a large proportion of voters who think that if David Cameron could just get something, they would swing from the no camp to the yes camp. And that's what I think he and Ed Miliband are both banking on. What are the red lines for voters? So this is the percentage of swing voters, who could go either way, who say the following are, of the utmost importance, Britain should only agree to renegotiation if we get this. And the number one issue here is limits on immigration. 61% of these swing voters think it's all about restrictions on immigration. Reform of the common agricultural policy is not particularly important. Devolved power and employment law, scrap Strasbourg Chamber, relax human rights law, greater control of EU, UK fisheries. Most of this is not really important. The only category in which a majority of these swing voters think is really important is migration. It's all about immigration. This is also interesting in that Europe is a kind of geeky, nerdy issue for a few politicians and a few editors of newspapers. Most voters in Britain don't really care about it. So this is from the latest YouGov survey, where the YouGov survey gives people a list of issues and says, which three of these issues do you think are the most important issues facing the country? So 40% of voters say the economy, then health, then pensions, then tax, then immigration, then housing, then education, then welfare. 10% of voters list Europe as one of the three most important issues facing the country. Even among UKIP voters, it's the fourth most important issue. So this is immigration, the economy, health, and pensions are more important to UKIP voters than Europe is. Among Lib Dem voters, among Conservative voters, Europe comes up a little bit, but not much. It's not really important for Labour or Lib Dem. It's not important for most voters in Britain. Immigration is the issue. Immigration is the key issue, and wrapping up of immigration and Europe together. And if they can find some solution to free movement of people, which is actually working its way through the EU institutions now, this is possible then for there to be a new settlement that I think the British government, the British public would support. So in sum, deeper economic and monetary union presents the UK with a difficult choice, as Nigel Lawson put it, isolated inside the EU or isolated outside the EU. This choice is recognised far more by the political elites than it is by the general public. Conservative Labour and the majority of the public want some kind of new relationship for the UK. Major treaty reform is probably unlikely. The only solution is some sort of mind the gap, particularly when it comes to migration issues. There's been a convergence of positions of Labour and the Conservative, particularly around their demands on free movement of people and some limited opt-outs and reform of the single market. Conservatives are committed to some sort of in-out referendum, regardless of the outcome of the negotiations, whereas Labour are only committed to a referendum if and when a new deal for Britain has been achieved. What could happen after the election? My reading of what the debates in the House of Commons on the private members' bill of James Wharton is that there's likely to be majority support in the next Parliament for a referendum. So if there's a Labour minority government, there's still a majority in the Commons in favour of a referendum. If there's a Conservative minority government, there's probably a majority in the Commons in favour of a referendum. So my bet would be we're going to have a referendum sometime soon. Now, are we going to wait till 2017? Again, I can see good reasons why we could have it earlier than that, in the spring of 2016 or perhaps even in the autumn of this year. The Conservatives, most backbenchers, want to get it over with quickly because they think that'll lance the boil of UKIP. The sooner they have it, the sooner they can kind of kill off UKIP. And they don't care whether the outcome is a yes or no. They really don't care. Most Labour MPs, equally, they don't care if it's a yes or a no. What they hope is that we have a referendum. It's going to split the Conservatives. What a great idea. Let's do that now. Meanwhile, the business lobby, as they see the opinion polls moving in a yes direction, are saying, let's do it now. This is terrible that we're waiting. What about all that uncertainty for another 2 years? Uncertainty in our negotiations in Brussels with the other EU member states on regulation of the single market, and uncertainty for foreign direct investment. We had the CEO of Ford on the radio last week saying, if Britain leaves the EU, this would be a disaster for Ford and we'd have to pull out of Britain. And if they're going to have a referendum, let's hope they have it quickly, because we don't like the uncertainty. That's a pretty strong message from Ford. And it's the same message you get from the Japanese car manufacturers and most other foreign investors in the UK. Deutsche Bank, for example, are the largest employers in the City of London. If we vote to leave the EU, they'll just close up shop and move to Frankfurt. What's the big deal? Okay.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. Right. Very good. Right. Now, last week when we got to this point, I asked you why you thought, and you've sort of touched on it with the saliency polling from YouGov this week, that why is it that politicians seem to be, apart from the immigration issue, slightly detached from public opinion with their endless interest in and obsession with Europe? Because even if it weren't for immigration, it would still be much more important for politicians than it is for the public. So compared with the NHS or schools or any of the other issues that show up in polling about what is salient, politicians devote an enormous amount of time and effort to it, and indeed UKIP has arisen largely off the back of it. Is there any research about why?
No, it's really hard.
Political elite has a different view to the public.
I think generally there are a series of issues that the elites are more interested in than the public is. Constitutional reform.
Yep.
Is a classic one. Reform of the electoral system, reform of the House of Lords, written constitution. You can put the EU in that category. These are big political issues that most of the public think this is really odd. We want jobs and healthcare and this sort of thing. It touches on people, I think, when immigration is really something they notice. And immigration has had a big impact on Britain. The volume of migrants from Central and Eastern Europe into the UK in the last 15 years is the largest volume of migration to the UK as a percentage of British population since the Huguenots came. It is massive. It's about 1 million people. And 1 million people that really is transforming parts of Britain that have never really seen migrants before. And it creates a range of different things. So one of it is an older generation that feels that this is a cultural challenge to their values. They see Britain changing in a way they don't like, that they want to roll Britain back to the 50s. I don't like change, and we've got rural areas now where suddenly you're seeing communities of migrants that just didn't exist before. Lincolnshire. You've got lower skilled workers who are competing directly for jobs. So you've got in particular sectors, so the building trades, you've got something that emerged after the local elections last year was rural areas where suddenly there was vote for UKIP in a bunch of rural areas, and they realised these were lower income voters whose people were competing for fruit picking jobs. Farmers who used to employ local labour to pick fruit in the summer now were just employing Romanians and Bulgarians to pick fruit because they were cheaper and they worked harder. So, there is a real economic competition, and that competition is felt very strongly in an economic downturn. So I think there's a combination of economic competition for lower skilled groups and a combination of, wow, this country is changing. When did I give consent for there to be sort of open borders and mass immigration to this country of the volume that we've seen over the last 15 years? And I think immigration and then immigration because this is mainly EU migration that is driving this, it's very easy to then connect the issue of migration to the issue of Europe. And that's what I think explains very much the success of UKIP. And why now all of this debate about Britain's relationship with Europe has come down to, in fact, a debate about migration.
Okay. Questions? Thoughts? Yeah.
Given the effects of migration on competition for jobs and wages, etc., should there be a referendum in the next few years? What do you think the social democratic case for EU membership would be, and do you think it'd be successful in recapturing the views of people in like Labour heartlands who have been attracted to UKIP?
I don't think there's a social democratic case for anything these days. I mean, why a social democratic case? Social democrats are declining all across Europe. The largest decline of any major political force in any country, all across Europe in the last 50 years. So making a social democratic case for anything is pretty hopeless. But would there be some kind of moderate, soft left, liberal / social democratic case for Europe? Perhaps.
Well, there were people. I mean, the Labour Party, if you call the Labour Party a social democratic party for a moment, had a sort of an internationalist wing to it, didn't it, traditionally, that it saw itself as part of a wider movement that transcended borders. And presumably, well, we know that inside the European Parliament and institutions, the Social Democrats and their views are powerful. And the centre-left group in the Parliament is a big one.
Yes, but Labour is deeply embarrassed by the European Social Democrats. Okay. They're much too social democratic for the British Labour Party. Oh dear. Okay. But no, it's more. But the case is about how do you win back? How does Labour win back hearts and minds of lower income groups in Doncaster and Rotherham who are voting for UKIP? Provide jobs. I mean, I remember after the European elections last May, being in a seminar for Labour strategists after the local and European elections, and I was talking about the rise of populist parties all across Europe and what the forces behind it were. Peter Kauner was talking about who are the people voting for, he's the head of YouGov, he was talking about who are the people who vote for UKIP. And then there was a Labour campaigner who's a Labour prospective parliamentary candidate for one of the seats in Stoke, Ruth, I can't remember her second name. She tells a story of canvassing in local elections and European elections in Stoke, a row of terraced houses that they had down as core Labour supporters. So this was a kind of get out the vote campaign, which is the new way you get people to vote. You don't go for swing voters, you go for core supporters to get them out to vote. So she knocked on the first door and a guy answered the door and he said, lost my job 30 years ago, been voting Labour all my life, and you haven't done anything for me, I'm going to vote UKIP. Knocks on the next door, and a woman answers the door and said, my son was laid off because he wants to hire Poles instead. I'm going to vote UKIP. She knocks on the next door, and a guy answers the door, and he says, my daughter's been waiting for a council house, and they keep giving it to all these Pakistanis who come here because they've got more kids. I'm going to vote UKIP. And by the end of the street, she had this down as this was get out the vote for solid Labour supporters. And the problem, she said, was I felt there was nothing I could say on the doorstep that my party was doing that would do anything for these people who live here. We're not doing anything that would generate jobs in this area or this part of the country, which is ultimately what this is about. So, and that's a problem facing centre-left parties all across Europe. My general view is that mainstream centre-left and mainstream centre-right in most countries in Europe represent capital cities, represent different sectors of capital cities. So centre-right represent globalised financial service industries, and the mainstream centre-left represent globalised creative industries. So, you know, Labour represents Islington and Camden, and the Tories represent Notting Hill. In Paris, the French socialists represent the left bank and the French conservatives represent the right bank. And it's the same in Denmark. The largest party in the polls in Denmark, they've got an election later this year, the largest party is the Danish People's Party, a radical right protest party. And their main supporters are lower income voters who live in post-industrial cities or rural areas in Jutland. So UKIP will be the second party to Labour in most industrial cities in the election and the second party to the Conservatives in most rural areas. The Front National are the second party to the French Socialists in all industrial cities outside Paris and the second party to the Conservatives in all rural areas. It's the same in Denmark. It's the same in the Netherlands with Wilders. It's increasingly the same in Sweden with the Swedish Democrats. So this is a deep structural problem. It's not just a UK problem. It's a deep structural problem about the decline of support for mainstream parties on centre-left and centre-right, and growing groups in society who are feeling excluded by changes in the economy that are partly a result of European integration, but also changes in the economy as a result of globalisation.
Right. We'll go 1, 2, 3.
Simon, can I just...
Wait, can you wait for the...
Kate's first, is she?
Simon, thank you very much. Can I just follow on from the last point? Because if one then extends this discussion to look at Greece and Spain, and possibly in France, although I think that's a rather more fluid situation at the present moment, we're beginning, you sound as though it's serious and worrying that the traditional parties are beginning to get into difficulties. Would it not be possible to look at that as being, in fact, quite encouraging? It might be uncomfortable for the status quo, it might be uncomfortable particularly for the sort of centre of Europe and the Brussels mafia, but is it, in fact, a rather interesting way in which people are beginning just to show some interest in politics, instead of limply going and voting for the same old parties year after year after year?
You said several things there. The first thing is about, Sweden. I think Greece and Spain, I think there's a distinction between member states in northwestern Europe, which are largely have gone through radical structural changes, but have globalising capital cities, and a periphery of Europe, which includes Ireland, Portugal, Spain, southern Italy, and Greece, which is going through really serious austerity measures. And the cleavage is a collapse in mainstream centre-left and growing radical left supported by younger urban voters largely, which is a very different phenomenon. It's got different phenomenon happening in Finland, in Scandinavia, Benelux, the UK, and probably most of France than the phenomenon that's happening on the austerity periphery. The effect is the same in terms of collapsing support for mainstream centre parties. I think it's fascinating. I think it's healthy for democracy that our democracies are able to reflect these deep underlying structural changes. This is why I actually think it's very positive for British democracy that we see the rise of UKIP. I'm not going to go out and vote for Farage, but I think it's very healthy for British democracy that we see the rise of UKIP and we see the rise of Greens and we see the rise of these other parties. If it means that mainstream parties will start to try and address what are legitimate concerns of sectors of society that have been left out from the major economic and political processes of the last 20 years. So in that sense, I agree with you. But I don't think any of them have really thought about that yet.
And that will presumably trigger a debate about voting systems at some point, which could create a completely reconfigured version of politics.
Yeah, bring it on.
Well, at some point, too, one would hope that politics would begin to affect, to some extent, the pressure of the debate that goes on within Brussels. Because that's I think, a lot of the feeling in areas of Europe at the moment.
And I think that's not really fair. That's not really fair in that, the European Parliament has a very large Eurosceptic bloc in it. The European Parliament is a very pluralist institution. The issues now being discussed on the table, if you look at the Commission's work programme, are radical reform to free movement of people as one of the key issues. What they recognise from the election outcome in May 2014 is that they have to start to address what are legitimate concerns of the people. And in two ways. What has Juncker done? Number one, a growth package for the European economy. And number two, address what they perceive to be the key issue that's driving the rise in radical right support, which is free movement of people. The message has been heard, so we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I think it's not quite fair to say they live in a bubble and they're not responding in any way. I think they are now starting to get the message.
Right, there's a question here and then down here.
Thanks. I have a question just based on what you said earlier. Is democracy in a way incompatible with the free movement of people? It seems to be what you're suggesting to some degree.
There's definitely a debate about on both the right and the left, about whether the free movement of people is a real challenge to the current design of our democratic and political institutions. For the right, it's about community. It's about solidarity. You know, the community that we live in, we define this community, and these people are coming in and changing our community, and we're not making choices about that. For the left, it's about solidarity, and it's growing support. You can read it in the pages of Prospect magazine in Britain or in the Social Democrats in Sweden, for example, to say that the welfare state is built on a sense of solidarity. And if you have the free movement of people, you're undermining solidarity, because people aren't willing to transfer, to redistribute wealth, because they only redistribute wealth because they have this sense of solidarity. So this is a sort of blue Labour. Labour shouldn't have allowed so many people to come in. It's undermining the welfare state. So there's definitely a growing debate about that. But then there's interesting things happening the other side, which is, for example, Belgium has given voting rights in local elections to all people resident in Belgium. Not just EU migrants resident in Belgium, all people resident in Belgium. And Italy is about to do the same. And, you know, so much for us being so progressive ahead of the rest, but actually, Britain, we're not even discussing it. We should be giving voting rights to anyone who's resident and paying taxes in this country in local elections. Why is it not an issue? Why is it not being discussed? Why aren't the Greens making it an issue, for example? People, you know, my wife has lived here for 18 years and paid taxes and can't vote.
Right, down here.
Thank you. An observation and a comment. Earlier today, Kenneth Clark was at the German Symposium, and in discussing the rise of these, what they were calling fringe parties, he called it the symptom of escapism. You know, the world, it's just too hard, so let's exit stuff. We're not against. Everyone was against something. We weren't really for anything. It was a protest movement. I thought that was quite a useful way of saying it. It is a part of these countries where there's escapism. That was a comment.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah. The observation, though, is, obviously from my accent you can tell I'm from Australia, I just find the conversation here in the UK around the issue of the EU, and then last year around Scotland, to be very sort of done haphazardly. So questions of lopping off a bit of the country seem to creep up and then nearly, occur. And then what you've presented over this week and last week was a complete illogical debate that's going on. And coming from Australia, it's surprising how unsophisticated it is and how all over the place it is. And then if you fast forward to the referendum, you don't have majority vote, you don't have compulsory voting, and you can get it through by 51%. It just seems kind of laughable that questions of such nature are treated this way. So I was just wondering, do you guys ever step back and go, well, we'll let this go?
This does take us neatly back to the question of the British constitutional arrangements. And if you see it one way, the flexibility, the way they allow things to be done on an ad hoc basis, to make radical change, to do things incrementally if you want to, and all of that, versus it's a mess. Now, is this part of the it's a mess part, or of the constitutional British way
of so
constitutionality?
I've heard Ken Clarke say this thing. There's a narrative amongst a lot of mainstream politicians in lots of countries in Europe that this is just a short-term phenomenon, that is just because we've got an economic downturn and these are people moaning and they'll just come back to us. I think that's really wrong. I think these are deep structural changes that are going on amongst the electorate that are leading to real breakages in traditional support bases of parties, and they're not going to get them back. So I think it's an empirical question to see whether he's right or I'm right, and we will know in 5 or 10 years. At one level, you can argue that classically in British politics, they sort of make it up as they go along, and it's very faddish, and it's driven by whatever is the latest thing going on, the latest chat on Twitter or social media, or the latest editorial in the Telegraph or the Times or the Guardian, and the latest migration figures, or the latest opinion poll on Scotland, one rogue opinion poll, and suddenly they're promising to give them independence within the UK. It's very, at one level you can think that British politicians are unbelievably short-sighted. I'd say all politicians in democracies are short-sighted and are becoming more and more myopic than they used to be. And I think you can say the same in Australia.
I wasn't holding us up as
But I think that's a legitimate criticism of democratic politics in lots of places. And part of that might be because a lot of the big questions facing democratic politics in lots of countries in the world, politicians cannot actually change. The type of choices that politicians used to make, the great years of democracy in the 1950s, you really could decide to radically change the economy, nationalise the top 100 industries, privatise the top 100 industries, raise tax rates to a marginal rate of 90%, cut tax rates to a marginal rate of 30%, decide to open borders, decide to close borders. You know, the kind of radical policy choices that democratic politics was about in the 50s and 60s is just not there anymore. The room for manoeuvre, and partly that's globalisation, but that room for manoeuvre within the EU is even more constrained than it is in a global world. And part of, I think, the backbenchers of the Conservatives, the backbenchers of Labour and UKIP think that if they can throw off the shackles of the EU, we can return to that great age of democracy and we can freely govern ourselves and make free choices. That's definitely not the experience of other countries in the world within a globalised world. Whether you're inside the EU or outside the EU, the big challenge for all democracies all across the world is the de facto movement of people. So I like to think of it in the following sense. In the 20th century, the big challenge for democracy was the de facto free movement of capital. That was a big challenge to how we thought about our democratic politics. And we had to think about how do we come to terms with that. And for the 21st century, the big challenge for democracies is the de facto free movement of people. We cannot control the movement of people anymore, and that doesn't matter whether you're Australia or the United States or a member state within the EU. And if the fact that we might leave the EU, we then think that we can control our borders, of course we can't. Actually, what will probably happen is the first time we'll actually have a debate about illegal migrants in the UK, which we refuse to talk about. We're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't even talk about illegal migrants. Latest estimates, we have several 100,000 illegal migrants in the UK, but it's never discussed. Spain, they talk about it, and they've had to go through these processes of giving amnesties. It's the biggest issue in the US about a route to citizenship for illegal migrants. It's a big issue in Australia. It's a big issue in lots of countries. We don't even discuss it in the UK. Why? Because we can focus on other migrants who are here actually legally, that we don't have to talk about this. And occasionally you get the Chinese cockle farmers in Morecambe Bay and the waves come in quickly and they all die and everyone went, geez, where did they come from? But it's not really... So I don't think the UK is that different to... We like to think that we're that different to the rest of the world. I don't think we're that different. I think politics is really constrained and as a result of media and the new style of politics and these constraints, politicians become really, really myopic. And that doesn't matter whether you're in the UK or in France or in Germany or the United States or anywhere in the world.
And it is worth adding that the Conservative plus Labour vote was over 97% in the UK in the 1955 general election. And in the last general election, it was 65. And in some polls recently, it's been lower than that. So there is a long-term change going on within the UK, as well as some of this short-term noise. But I think
there was another question you asked, which is about the Britain stumbling into major constitutional change without really thinking about the long-term consequences. I do think there we may have a slightly different, slightly more relaxed view about let's say, turnout in referendums, in that there's generally an assumption in the UK that silence is approval. So if you can't be bothered to vote, then you're indifferent between the outcome. So, that's your problem. So I guess if there was a referendum on Scotland and the turnout was 30% and they voted yes to leave, then there'd be big questions of legitimacy. But the turnout was 80-something%. It was the highest turnout in any vote of any kind in Britain since 1918. So in that sense, I think it would have been a legitimate outcome. I had a fascinating experience 2 years ago of a delegation from China that was visiting the LSE from the Chinese Communist Party school. And we had these translators in the room, but the only thing they wanted to talk about was Scotland. They could not get it into their head that Britain would allow a part of the country to have a vote and that they could vote to leave and we would let them leave. How does that work? They just couldn't get their head around the fact that a democracy would let this happen. And we very smugly thought, wow, yeah, that's democracy, buddies. I mean, that's how it works. So it is...
We still don't understand.
Sorry?
We still don't understand.
And not just the Chinese. I think the Spanish don't understand. Other parts of Europe, France definitely wouldn't understand that either. But we definitely have this conception in the UK that it was a voluntary union and it can be dissolved voluntarily. Scotland voluntarily decided to form a union with England 300 years ago, and they can voluntarily decide to leave the union.
And it does tell you something about the effectively the assent of the people to govern operates differently and separately in Scotland, and that's a profound, constitutionally important idea, I think, that the UK government, or the sovereignty that's often discussed at the core of the UK parliamentary system, in the end couldn't any longer remove the Scottish Parliament. So in effect, the sovereignty has gone because the peoples are different. The people in Scotland are UK citizens, but they're also the people of Scotland. I think that's a profound
and the other thing
change.
It's not that Scotland are massively more pro-European than the English are, actually. The polls are not that different, but they are marginally more. And so you could end up with a situation that the UK votes by a small majority to leave the EU, but the majority in Scotland is against leaving. And then I think you could see very much Scotland then voting to leave the UK to stay in the EU. So a vote to leave the EU, I think, would be a vote to dissolve the United Kingdom.
Which will be an element in the competition, the referendum itself. Question here.
Hi there. Given the debate on the Commission's work programme last night in the Commons, and you mentioned the sort of shift in Cameron's demands, what do you think is the government's real position or opinion on, for example, Frans Timmermans or the European Commission's work programme as a whole?
I think the government is pleasantly surprised with what the Commission has put forward. They like Timmermans, and the less but better, which I think this Commission is taking far more seriously than the last Commission. I think Timmermans is very similar position on a lot of these things. I think the Capital Markets Union is really very much... The French are worried about this being a UK-promoted venture by Brussels, and this essentially would very much protect the role of the City of London in the single market, and make the London the centre of capital markets in Europe, which is what London wants. And so this would be a huge benefit if the Capital Markets Union is passed. We don't yet know what's in the mobility package. And I think talking to Claude Moraes, who is a Labour MEP who's chair of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, which is the committee that does all the free movement business, I said to him, surely reform of the 2004 directive on the free movement of people is conspicuous by its absence in the Commission's work programme. And he says he's expecting it to be on the work programme in 2016. So I can imagine that what the Commission is doing is trying to get support for quite a major reform of the free movement directive. A lot of other member states are making similar demands. The Dutch, the Danish, the Swedes, the Finns, the French, even now growing within the CDU in Germany, because Alternative for Deutschland, an anti-European party in Germany, was originally just mobilising on opposition to German bailouts of Greece, and now is mobilising on anti-migration. We don't want to give benefits to migrants from Central and Eastern Europe in Germany. Of course, and migrants actually from Southern Europe into Germany now, increasingly from Greece and Spain into Germany. And the German CDU is adopting a lot of that position as well. So I think there is potentially a majority in the Council and a majority in the European Parliament in terms of quite radical reform to the free movement of people. And the Commission is waiting to put that coalition together before it makes that proposal in 2016. So I think the Commission, the British government, is actually, despite its rhetoric against Juncker, quite satisfied with the way the Commission is shaping up in terms of its agenda going forward.
Yes, I'll take these two questions together quickly, if we can. One here, one there.
You made it sound earlier a bit as though Europe, apart from Britain, was a steady ship sailing serenely into the future of a macro-political
I was giving you one particular spin. I don't believe that.
Yeah, but as you know, there are a lot of tensions building up in Europe. I just wonder how you think the calculus of all this changes if we begin to see crumbling around the edges of the Eurozone, or if there's a much bigger breakup of consensus within Europe.
Yeah, I was giving you a particular take that's a take that is framed by the more Eurosceptic views in the UK that says that there's a growing gap emerging between the building of deeper economic and monetary union, which actually the British government is very much in favour of because they want the euro to be saved and they think that will help the European economy grow, which will generate growth in the UK. But you're right in saying that that architecture is not really a fiscal union. There's not euro bonds. There's constitutional challenges against the ECB's lender of last resort strategy that could yet go back and be rejected by the German Bundesverfassungsgericht. So the ECJ has ruled, and now it's back in the hands of the German Constitutional Court, and they may say we don't accept the ECJ's ruling on this. That could really happen. If I believe my colleagues in the law department here, they think that is going to happen. That would, in one fell swoop, end quantitative easing and any of the bailouts the ECB has been doing. Meanwhile, we've got what's going on in Greece. I think, talking to Charlie Goodhart here in the economics department, his view is that we will see the drachma being reintroduced, perhaps as a parallel currency to the euro, so that employers can start to pay people in drachma, and the government can pay people in drachma. And so if that happens, that would be a major shock. But Germany I think Greece was in a much stronger negotiating position 2 or 3 years ago than it is now. Because the big fear that Germany and the Netherlands and Finland and the other net contributors into the ESM, what they feared more than anything was contagion. What they feared is if Greece goes down, the markets will then focus on Portugal, and then Spain, and then Ireland, and then Italy, and then France. But now, when you see structural reforms actually starting to kick in and growth starting to come back in Ireland, in Portugal, and reforms in Spain, I think Greece is now very much on its own, and most of the capital markets are actually saying it's just about Greece. It's not about these other ones. So there isn't going to be any contagion. So Greece really hasn't got a leg to stand on. So now I think there's growing support within Germany for the let Greece go. So, we can play hardball with them, and they're really in a very weak position negotiating. So I think you're right, we may well see Greece going, and I think this would play very badly in the British debate, because I think this would be very much of, look, the European house is breaking, the EU is in crisis, why would we want to be a member of this? I think part of the growing support has been a sense of, actually, Europe seems to have got through its crisis and has got its act together. When the EU seems to be working, the British people say, we want to be part of this club that's working. And when the EU doesn't seem to be working, I think there's people in Britain who say, do we really want to be part of this thing? So I think you're right, that the crisis in the Eurozone will feed through to declining support in the UK.
Very short question, very short answer.
Right, very quick. So you outlined the 5 options for Britain to resolve its EU problems. My question is the mind the gap and widen the channel options, although they'll overcome sort of the current problems, in the long term, is it really you either are in it to join the Eurozone or you're leaving it? Is this idea that you can be in this club with however many members and only 2 don't want to join the Eurozone, is that actually a stable sort of institutional arrangement?
I think you're right in that it doesn't resolve the deep underlying question, but I think we haven't got those long-term time horizons. I think there could be a temporary solution for the next decade, which is the current status quo of us in the EU but not part of the euro is totally sustainable for a decade. Beyond that, I think you're right. It has to be decided one way or the other.
Okay, first, thank you very much, Simon. Second, next week we'll be hearing about general elections in Britain from Professor Vernon Bogdanor. This is a sort of topical end to the GV311 run of lectures. And as a bonus, for those of you who have the time and inclination, the Scottish First Minister will be speaking at the LSE next Monday. This is Nicola Sturgeon, Monday at 11 o'clock at the school. Now, it's going to be a ticketed event, so you'd have to apply for tickets to conferences. But any GV311 students who can't get tickets, and you want to go, don't have to, but if you want to go, let me know, all right? And I'll find a way. But anybody else, just apply. Thank you very much. See you next week.